Great, thank you very much. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I'm going to take you from the misty shores of Necker and bring you back to GB. So I'm just going to talk about GB and our interconnection with our close neighbours and also some of our not so close neighbours as well in Iceland. So my role in National Grid, as Rick says, I'm Julian. So I'm head of the electricity customer services. So all connections to the national system across GB need to come through my team. So I'm in a very privileged position that I get to see all that's going on, right the way from new nuclear to large offshore wind to the impact of embedded generation on the distribution networks and that whole spectre, including interconnectors. So before I go into interconnectors, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of what we're seeing right now in GB in terms of transmission-connected renewable generation that's moving us towards this new future of low-carbon energy, and actually show you the appetite that developers have, many of you in this room and also at this conference, to demonstrate the commitment to move towards this renewable future, but actually just highlight some of the issues that is creating, because our ambition here in GB is unprecedented across the world. And I just want to highlight some of the issues that is also creating. So, just before I go into that, though, it's not always clear who National Grid are and why even we're here in Scotland. So, National Grid, from an electricity point of view, we are the national system operator for GB. So, therefore, we operate the markets and we operate the safe and secure operation of the network across GB. In England and Wales, National Grid also owns the transmission network. So, we own sort of the highways, the motorways of the electricity network. But we're also a gas company, and in GB, we own and operate the transmission system for gas across all of GB, and also we have gas distribution supplying 11 million customers across the camel-shaped shaded area there across the middle of England and Wales. But we're also the second largest utility in America also, which is a fantastic statistic when you think about a GB company being the second largest American utility. And whichever way you cut our company, we're sort of 50-50, transmission, distribution, electricity, gas, UK, US, it's all about 50-50. So in terms of facilitating the move to a low-carbon future, we are front and center of that. Our networks need to bring the renewable energy to where it's consumed, but also we can do a lot with our networks to make those more efficient, and certainly from a gas perspective, to stop methane leaking into the atmosphere and creating climate change because of that. So, where are we in GB then? This is the ambition. 98 gigawatts of new generation with contracts to connect the transmission system in the next 12 years. 98 gigawatts. Put that in context, the peak this winter was just around 50 gigawatts of demand. And it was a mild winter, I understand that. But demand isn't growing year on year like we thought it was. We don't think that's going to happen until at least the mid-20s. So demand is currently falling. 50 gigawatts peak demand this winter. And there's an ambition out there of 98 gigawatts of new generation that wishes to connect and has commitments to connect to our network. Of that 98 gigawatts, 40 gigawatts is renewable generation, a fantastic sort of ambition in the renewable sector. That's a mixture of offshore wind, onshore wind, wave and tidal. 40 gigawatts by 2020, that's 6 years' time. However, if you look at the gone green targets, sort of the renewable targets for the government, the 2020 targets, we think we need, depending on which scenario you use, roughly 25, 26 gigawatts of renewable generation in total to meet those climate change reduction targets for 2020. We already have roughly 10 gigawatts of generation connected to our network, so we need about another 16 gigawatts, and yet there's 40 gigawatts of developers with commitments to connect. And I bet if I ask the question, who thinks we're going to meet the renewable targets in 2020, I'm not sure we would get 100% of the hands shown in this room. And yet, the developers, the commitments, the grid companies, we are building network and making investments to connect 40 gigawatts of renewable generation. The levy control framework can't afford 40 gigawatts of renewable generation by 2020. So we're in this sort of, what on earth do we do? We're trying to build a network for 40 gigawatts. We know 40 gigawatts is not required. We know the levy control framework won't pay for 40 gigawatts. So what generation is going to connect and where? So my big message is we need some certainty around this future, around the next 6 years, as to which generation is going to connect and where. There's a danger that we're just paralyzed because the ambition is so great that actually how do you make some decisions to move forward? And there's some big consequences to this. The Scottish TOs and ourselves for large infrastructure projects have to go to the regulator to ask for money to invest in those projects. And they're saying, really? Do you really need that very large investment, £100 million plus investment, to connect that renewable generation? We don't need that much renewable generation. So the regulator's saying, well, actually, we're not going to give you the funding, or you need to go and do some more work on the needs case. Going into the planning and planning a new overhead line, saying we need to build this 100 kilometres new overhead line to connect this renewable generation. And the community's going, really? We don't need 40 gigawatts of renewable generation. So really, is this going to come forward? So, and it means that the transmission owners across GB don't have certainty. So it's sort of when do we invest and how do we get that commitment? So we're sort of paralyzed right now, I feel, that actually there's so much ambition out there, and there's more ambition coming, 100 new applications per year for renewable generation. At the same time, there are 250 modifications to the existing contracts. It's a massive churn, and we're just sort of struggling to know what to do about that. Anyway, I was here to talk about interconnectors. So if we do get this huge amount of renewable generation, which we will, the question when, but it'll come at some point, what role do interconnectors have? Now, interconnectors in GB have been around for 25 years or more. And the first one of those is the famous one, the interconnection with France, the 2 gigawatt project developed by the CEGB, as it was, back in the late 80s with France. That's been a fantastic tool and mechanism for us to help balance our system and to connect ourselves to our neighbouring markets. More recently, we've had a new interconnector with Ireland, 500 megawatts from North Wales, and a connection into the Netherlands with the BritNed project. And these interconnector projects are deriving great value. They're deriving great value in terms of security of supply, because at the times of us getting short on supply in GB, our energy price goes up, and therefore it's higher than what it is in Europe, so therefore European generators are selling into the GB market. Conversely, when the market in our close neighbours is when the market price is low, then our generators in GB get the opportunity to sell into those markets also. Over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a huge drive for new interconnectors. So the lines in red on that slide are those projects which are contracted with National Grid. So they're part of that 98 gigawatts. They are contracted to us for a connection. That puts commitments on them to develop, and it puts commitments on us to develop the network to allow them to connect. So there's another 7.2 gigawatts of more interconnectors planned to connect before 2020, which is a fantastic opportunity because, again, it allows us to have greater flexibility on our network. It allows us to have greater security of supply. And you'd have read the Daily Mail headlines, we're due for blackouts. We are not due for blackouts partly because of interconnectors. Because that 2%, 5% sort of margin that they talk about next winter assumes interconnectors are afloat. They won't be afloat because if our margins are that tight on the day, then our energy price will be really high and Europe will sell to GB. So we'll be able to manage our security of supply. So huge ambition out there in terms of interconnectors. Supply chain, to me, is a challenge. HVDC cable manufacturers, there's not very many of them in the world. And just the link to Norway is about 6 years' worth of cable build, 4 years' worth of cable build in one factory. And that's just one of those links. So there needs to be investment all the way back through the supply chain if there was certainty that these projects were going to go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but is the 7.2 in addition to the 4?
Yes, in addition to. So more than doubling of our current interconnectors. So that's the traditional form of interconnectors. GB has always been keen that these should be merchant, so you should be able to invest in these as private investors and make money. The rest of Europe says that interconnectors should be a regulated entity, as are the sort of assets owned by transmission companies and distribution companies here in GB. So we're at odds. Our regulatory regime is at odds with the rest of Europe. So we're trying to find a hybrid. So if you're watching sort of the NEMO project, which is linked to Belgium, there's a new regulatory cap and floor mechanism that the regulator is working with that developer on to try and see if we can get a merchant regulated hybrid type of approach going forward. But there's other types of interconnectors, which if you're following these types of things, there's people wanting to develop significant generation onshore in Ireland. These will be point-to-point interconnectors, taking onshore renewable generation that's not connected to the Irish system and connected directly into GB. Currently, there's 10 gigawatts of that contracted. Personally, I think there's a bit of duplication going on there, so maybe it's not 10, but maybe 5 gigawatts possible, maybe 6 or 7. But again, finding a regulatory regime that allows onshore wind in Ireland to receive the CFDs, the subsidies from GB consumers, to get access to that renewable energy. Similarly, there's a little green line with the Isle of Man. Again, the Isle of Man is a very windy place, fantastic waters in terms of developing offshore wind. Should we take the opportunity and allow our subsidies to flow overseas to build the interconnectors to get greater access to a greater source of renewable energy, and at the same time increase our diversity of energy sources in terms of weather patterns, etc. So there's a huge ambition out there for new interconnector projects. So interconnectors today, what are they doing? Well, already they're giving us access to lower priced energy in neighbouring markets. If you look at the 4-year period for 2008 to 2012, 4 times more energy was imported into the UK than we exported across those interconnectors. That means our energy price in the GB was much, much lower for 4 times the period of time. So massive economic benefits and reduction in energy bills. There's a report that National Grid Interconnectors business, so I'm representing the regulated business, but our business development colleagues, they issued a report earlier this year, and they talked about a doubling of today's interconnectors will save the consumer £1 billion a year. That equates to £13 per energy bill, domestic energy bill, per year. And as we've already seen, the ambition is to more than double. So we're talking somewhere like £20 a year savings by investing in these assets. Energy security, they've already proven themselves that when things do get tight in GB, we have system operator trading arrangements so we can get a lot of energy very quickly from our neighbours and help us secure the nation's energy supply. And also today, even they're managing help balance the system with the intermittency of renewable energy and bringing energy in and being stood there as a big sort of reserve pot of energy that we can pull on as and when we need it. The environmental impacts of interconnectors, even today, it's given us access to renewable energy or low-carbon energy, so nuclear energy from France, obviously, when that's coming in from France, that's predominantly low-carbon energy that we are using in the UK. If we develop these further, we will get greater access to other sources of renewable energy, hydro in Norway, onshore wind in Ireland, and hydrogeothermal from Iceland. These are all projects, all of which are very actively being developed. And the economics of this, lower energy prices for the consumer, but also our generators in GB have a more attractive market to play in because there's more, effectively more demand for them to feed when these interconnectors are exporting. So as we look to the future, though, what does greater interconnection mean? Well, the EU is very keen to have a single EU market, so therefore we don't want to be an outlier on the edge of that. By having more interconnection, we can be fully integrated into the single European market if that were to happen, and what does that mean? We can have greater reserve and response sharing across the EU. So instead of each member state having its reserve and response holding, actually we can use the interconnectors to share that reserve and response and share that cost and to share that investment in sort of standby generation. Because it's high voltage DC, it's like fire gaps in a forest. It's not part of the asynchronous sort of system operating at 50 hertz, whatever that you get sort of in the mainland GB. These are fire breaks. These are walls to the rest of Europe, and also when you have them within Europe, that actually if there is a system issue, it controls the spread across Europe. Yeah. So UK treatment I talked about already, merchant or fully regulated question. Market coupling. Again, the EU is saying actually more interconnection, it'll bring markets together, and maybe there's a market split between the north-south flows in GB and somewhere in northern France, and actually the interconnector is part of the same market, bringing that together. And as we said already, we get the opportunity to share renewable resources and also the targets. So to summary then, on my last slide, increasingly important role to play interconnectors. With all this renewable generation in GB and low carbon and intermittency, some massive benefits in terms of economic benefits to us as consumers, economic benefits to the market, and greater system security in helping us avoid any potential sort of system security issues, security supply issues as we go forward over the next few years. Thank you for your time. That was it for interconnectors.